He was locked inside a 12-foot piece of shattered aluminum falling from 28,000 feet over Germany. No wings, no engines, no control, no way out. Inside that wreckage was 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, and he was still alive. But to understand how a man ends up alone inside the tail of a destroyed B-17, you have to go back to the morning of November 29, 1943. More than 300 B-17 flying fortresses crossed into German airspace that day. Their target was Bremen. One of those bombers carried the name Ricky Tiki Tavi. It was only on its fourth combat mission. Moran was assigned to the most isolated position on the aircraft, tail gunner. By the time the bombs were released, Ricky Tiki Tavi had already slipped behind formation. Falling back even slightly meant something very specific over Germany. You became the only target that mattered. German fighters came in waves. Bf-110 heavy fighters launched rockets into the fuselage. Then Bf-109s and FW-190s closed from multiple angles, pressing in from high and low, cutting across the bomber's blind spots. From the tail compartment, Moran fired both .50 caliber machine guns into the oncoming fighters. Tracers stitched through the sky behind him. Then the intercom voices began to disappear, one by one. 8 of the 10 crewmen were killed in the attack. The navigator managed to bail out from the front section. Moran remained, alone. Then a German flak shell struck the fuselage. The aircraft broke apart. The wings, engines, and nose section tore away. What remained was the rear fuselage, a 12-foot section of aluminum, still moving forward at altitude. And Moran was still inside it. He tried to open the escape hatch. The metal had twisted on impact. It would not move. His parachute had been damaged during the attack. There was no clear exit, no stable footing, no control. 4 miles below lay the German countryside. He had no way to slow the fall, no way to steer, no way to jump. The tail section began to drop, but before that descent reached its end, there is something about Moran's position that has to be understood. The tail gunner's station on a B-17 was the most isolated combat position on any Allied bomber. On the ground, few would voluntarily enter that space. At 25,000 to 30,000 feet in minus 60-degree temperatures, with enemy fighters closing from behind, it became something else entirely. To reach the tail, a gunner crawled the full length of the aircraft. He moved past the cockpit, through the radio room, then across a narrow catwalk suspended over the open bomb bay, barely 9 inches wide. Below that catwalk were the bay doors and open sky. A misstep meant a fatal fall. Beyond that was the waist gun section. Then finally, a narrow tunnel into the tail compartment. The space waiting there was roughly 4 feet wide. There was no real seat. The gunner knelt on the floor, leaning part of his weight against a small bicycle-style saddle. His legs folded beneath him, his knees pressed into the metal framing. In front of him sat 2 Browning M 2.50 caliber machine guns. Each weighed over 60 pounds. Each carried more than 500 rounds of ammunition. The barrels protruded through plexiglass panels at the rear of the aircraft. That plexiglass was not armor. A 20mm cannon shell would pass through it without resistance. If the gunner was taller than 5'10", his helmet scraped the ceiling. Oxygen hoses, heated suit wiring, intercom cables, ammunition belts, and parachute harness straps crowded every inch of space. The parachute itself was too bulky to wear while operating the guns. It was kept within reach, in theory. In practice, under fire, reaching it could be another matter entirely. Once sealed in position, the tail gunner could not see the rest of the crew. The nearest man was more than 20 feet forward, around a bend in the fuselage, hidden behind bulkheads and equipment. Communication existed only through the intercom. If that failed, the tail gunner was alone with whatever was coming from behind. Veteran tail gunner Ken Tucker of the 15th Air Force described the crawl to his position before every mission from Foggia, Italy. Through the tunnel, onto the bicycle seat. Oxygen connected, heated suit plugged in. Tucker considered himself a loner. The isolation did not disturb him. His first combat mission, however, was flown with a crew he had never met. Standard procedure for new gunners. He went over Munich with strangers. As they crossed the Alps, the sky filled with flak. Black bursts detonated at altitude, thousands of them, each throwing razor-sharp fragments of steel in every direction. Tucker survived that mission. He would survive 34 more, but survival in the tail was conditional. If the oxygen line was severed, the gunner fixed it himself. If the heating failed, he endured it alone. If the intercom went silent, there was no reassurance. At 25,000 feet, the cold was not discomfort. It was a weapon. And on November 29, 1943, that weapon was waiting for Eugene Moran, inside a falling piece of airplane over Germany. The B-17 was designed to operate between 25,000 and 30,000 feet. At that altitude, the outside air temperature routinely fell to -50, sometimes -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft was not pressurized, it was barely insulated, and it was not properly heated. The fuselage was little more than a riveted aluminum tube. In the waist section, open gun ports allowed 180 mile-per-hour slipstream to rip through the aircraft. Even in the tail, where plexiglass shielded the gun position, the cold penetrated everything. Inside the tail compartment, the temperature was essentially the same as outside. At -60 degrees, exposed skin freezes in under a minute. Bare flesh touching metal bonds instantly. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns jammed regularly at altitude. Clearing a jam meant pulling the charging handle, reseating the ammunition belt, sometimes physically extracting a spent casing lodged in the chamber. That required dexterity. Dexterity required fingers, and fingers required warmth. Most gunners wore thick gloves, but when a weapon jammed, those gloves often had to come off. Some men used thin silk liners. Even then, they had seconds before frostbite began to set in. Every malfunction became a race, gun versus cold. The solution was the electrically heated flight suit. It was a one-piece coverall lined with thin resistance wires plugged into the aircraft's electrical system through a socket in the fuselage wall. The technology had been developed by General Electric, adapted from pre-war electric blanket testing. GE engineers had even built a mannequin called the Copper Man to measure heat distribution in bedding. The same wiring concept was repurposed for heated suits, gloves, and boot insoles. In theory, it allowed bomber crews to function at extreme altitude. In practice, it was unreliable. The wires were fragile. Movement bent them. Vibration fractured them. A single broken circuit could shut down heating to an entire arm or leg. Worse, damaged wires sometimes short-circuited and burned the wearer. Temperature regulation was crude. Some crewmen overheated and soaked their underlayers in sweat, which later froze solid when the heating failed. Others felt no heat at all. In 1943, a large percentage of frostbite cases among American bomber crews were traced not to exposure alone, but to failure of the electric flight suits. The equipment designed to save them often became the thing that failed first. Ken Tucker, flying missions out of Fallujah with the 15th Air Force, described the cold as constant, not dramatic, not sudden, just always there, a pressure against the skin, a creeping numbness. Later models improved wiring and added adjustable controls, but they never became fully dependable. A 10 or 12-hour mission left no margin for failure. If the suit failed halfway to the target, there was no backup. The tail gunner had it worst. Waist gunners at least worked in pairs. If one man's suit failed, the other could see it, intervene, help manage equipment. The ball turret gunner was cramped but enclosed. The pilot and co-pilot occupied the most insulated part of the aircraft. The tail gunner was alone. If his heating failed, no one saw it. If his oxygen line iced over and stopped flowing, no one felt it. If the intercom went silent, it might already be too late. At 25,000 feet, hypoxia and freezing could render a man unconscious in minutes. The cold killed quietly. German fighters did not, and they had a specific reason to aim for the tail first. When American heavy bombers first appeared over occupied Europe in 1942, German fighter pilots attacked from behind. It was the logical angle. Approaching from the rear matched the bomber's direction of travel, reducing closing speed and giving the fighter pilot more time to aim. He could settle behind the aircraft, hold steady, fire sustained bursts into the fuselage. Against early B-17 variants, it worked. Then the B-17E arrived. Boeing had added a powered tailgun position, 2.50 caliber Brownings covering the entire rear arc. German pilots who continued to approach from behind suddenly found themselves flying directly into concentrated defensive fire. The tail gunner changed the geometry of aerial combat. One German pilot later compared attacking a B-17 formation from the rear to trying to embrace a porcupine that was on fire. And it wasn't just one aircraft. A standard combat box of roughly 3 dozen B-17s could bring hundreds of defensive machine guns to bear. Tail gunners, waist gunners, ball turret gunners, overlapping arcs of fire. Luftwaffe analysis showed that destroying a B-17 from behind often required roughly 20 direct hits with 20mm cannon shells. Given average hit percentages, that meant expending extraordinary amounts of ammunition per bomber. From the front, the equation changed. The nose was structurally weaker, armor was thinner, defensive coverage forward was more limited, and the head-on closing speed exceeded 500 miles per hour. That gave American gunners almost no reaction time. 4 or 5 well-placed 20mm shells from a head-on pass could be enough. The Luftwaffe adapted, and when they did, the tail gunner's job became even more dangerous. The Luftwaffe adapted quickly. American crews began calling the new tactic 12 o'clock high. German fighters approached head-on from slightly above the bomber formation, diving directly through it at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. The firing window lasted barely 2 seconds. There was no time for correction, no second attempt on the same pass. The pilot had to commit, hold steady, and fire as the bomber filled his gun sight, then break away before collision. The best German pilots scored heavily this way. Average pilots often missed entirely. But even as frontal attacks increased, the tail was never safe. The Luftwaffe developed a coordinated pattern American crews nicknamed the tail gunner's headache. Fighters positioned themselves roughly 2,000 meters behind the formation, split left and right. Then, one by one, they dove at the rear bombers, spacing their attacks roughly 10 seconds apart. Each pass came from a slightly different angle. The goal was not a single perfect shot. The goal was saturation. The tail gunner could not track multiple targets simultaneously. While he engaged one attacker, another lined up behind him. Later in the war came the Sturmgruppen, heavily armored FW-190s fitted with additional cockpit protection and 30mm cannons. These aircraft pressed their attacks to within 150 meters before firing. At that distance, one 30mm shell could rip off a control surface or kill a crew member instantly. The tail gunner became the priority target. German pilots watched for stationary tail guns. If the turret stopped tracking, it signaled a bomber that had lost its rear defense. That aircraft immediately became the focus of concentrated attack. The contest between tail gunner and fighter pilot lasted the entire war. Tactics evolved, weapons improved, formations tightened, then loosened. But the equation remained the same. The tail gunner sat at the point of maximum exposure, facing whatever came from behind with 2 guns and roughly 1,100 rounds of ammunition. The question was never whether the position was dangerous. The question was how long a man could survive in it. The numbers were unforgiving. When crews joined the 8th Air Force in England, they were told their combat tour was 25 missions. Complete 25, and you went home. On paper, it sounded achievable. In 1943, the statistical probability of completing that tour was roughly 1 in 4. 3 out of 4 crews would be shot down, killed, or captured before reaching mission 25. The odds improved in 1944, after long-range P-51 Mustang escorts began accompanying bomber formations deep into Germany. But the cost remained staggering. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than any other American command during the war. More than 26,000 airmen were killed in action. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war. In total, 4,754 B-17s were lost in combat. Out of 12,731 flying fortresses built, roughly 1 in 3 never returned. For the British, the numbers were even harsher. RAF Bomber Command flew primarily at night. That reduced fighter interception but offered no protection against radar-guided flak. The statistics were stark. For every 100 men who joined Bomber Command, 51 were killed on operations. 9 died in training accidents before ever reaching combat. 12 became prisoners of war. 3 were seriously wounded. Only 24 completed their service unharmed. 3/4 of those who joined were killed, wounded, or captured. Among the dead were approximately 20,000 rear gunners. The Yorkshire Air Museum documented that figure. 20,000 men killed in the most isolated position on the aircraft. The average age across bomber crews was 21. and the tail gunner's odds were shaped by one simple mechanical fact: he was the last man who could get out. In an emergency, fire, loss of control, structural failure, the forward and midsection crew had immediate access to escape hatches. Pilots exited through cockpit windows or forward hatches. Navigator and bombardier had the nose hatch. Waist gunners were steps from the main fuselage door. The ball turret gunner at least had nearby crew to help retract the turret and pull him inside. The tail gunner had none of that. To bail out, he had to disconnect oxygen, unplug the heated suit, unbuckle harness, grab the parachute from its storage rack, clip it to his chest, then crawl forward through a narrow tunnel past the tailwheel assembly into the waist section. In a stable aircraft, it took time. In a spinning, burning, or braking bomber, it was often impossible. A flat spin could pin a man against the fuselage walls with centrifugal force. Fire could block the crawlway. Structural damage could twist the tunnel shut. More than 2,800 American airmen were killed in training accidents alone, not in combat, not over Germany, but in the daily practice of flying tight formation, preparing for what awaited them in real missions. And on November 29, 1943, when Ricky Tiki Tavi broke apart over Bremen, every one of those factors converged in the worst possible way. Because Eugene Moran was in the one position with the least margin for survival. Wingtips collided in tight formation. Aircraft stalled in turbulence. Crews died in training, learning the precision required to survive missions some of them would never live to fly. The men who completed a full combat tour were not just skilled, they were statistical anomalies. Survival required more than courage. It required timing, weather, formation placement. The exact second a flak burst detonated 10 feet to the left instead of 10 feet to the right. Some men had that margin. One of them was a 20-year-old from California named Larry Stevens. He climbed into the tail of a B-17 called Full House and walked away 35 missions later. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Stevens was still in high school in Alhambra, California. Too young to enlist, he volunteered as an air raid warden, walking neighborhood streets at night, knocking on doors, telling families to black out their windows. By 1943, he was old enough. He joined the Army Air Forces and trained as a gunner at Fort Myers, Florida. Twice a day, he shot skeet targets under clear skies. It felt routine, manageable. Then a letter arrived. His older brother, Ernie, had been killed in action at Messina, Sicily. Stevens graduated gunnery school in December 1943 and was assigned to a 10-man B-17 crew as tail gunner. He took to the position immediately. Everyone else on the aircraft had proximity. A man nearby, even if only across an intercom line. The tail gunner had none. Stevens did not mind. He knelt on the floor, leaned against the small bicycle seat, and watched the empty sky behind the bomber. His aircraft, a B-17G, carried the name Full House. Stevens flew in what crews called Tail End Charlie, last plane in the squadron element, farthest back, most exposed. If fighters attacked from behind, Full House absorbed it first. On March 31, 1944, Stevens and his crew sailed for England aboard the liner Queen Elizabeth, zigzagging across the Atlantic to avoid U-boats. By late April, they were flying combat. The first mission brought light flak and no fighters. It would not stay that way. Over the next 4 months, Stevens flew missions over France, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Full House bombed submarine pens, airfields, V-1 and V-2 rocket sites. They dropped supplies to resistance fighters. On June 6, 1944, they flew over Normandy while the beaches burned below. On one mission returning from Poland, Stevens removed his oxygen mask at 10,000 feet, believing the danger had passed. Then the pilot shouted. The aircraft veered out of formation and began to dive. Stevens looked forward through the fuselage and saw smoke filling the interior. Something inside the aircraft was burning. Waist gunner Gordon Langford grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran forward, across the 9-inch catwalk over the open bomb bay doors, holding the extinguisher in both hands. He was not wearing a parachute. Below him were open bay doors and open sky. He crossed anyway. Langford extinguished the fire. On August 25, 1944, Larry Stevens completed his 35th mission. He was 20 years old. In 4 months, he had flown from bases in England, Russia, and Italy. He had crossed occupied Europe dozens of times. He had spent hundreds of hours alone in the tail compartment of Full House, watching the sky and waiting. When he returned to New York, a customs inspector glanced at the ribbons on his uniform and told him to go home and enjoy himself. He did not. He volunteered to train as a tail gunner on a B-25 Mitchell for the planned invasion of Japan. The war ended while he was still preparing. He returned to Alhambra, joined the fire department, served 31 years. Later, he wrote a memoir titled "It Only Takes One." He had beaten the odds. But not every tail gunner survived by simply completing his tour. Some survived by doing something the statistics did not allow for. The man who fell over Bremen was one of them. And what happened during his descent was not luck. It was not passive survival. It was an act of war. Eugene Moran was born on July 17, 1924, in rural Wisconsin. He grew up on a farm near Soldiers Grove, shoveling manure, tending livestock, working fields through long seasons. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was 17. He waited. In October 1942, the month he turned 18, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces. 2 years later, he would find himself inside the tail of a shattered bomber falling through German sky. And unlike Larry Stevens, he would not have 35 missions behind him. He would have one chance. On the way down. After training, Eugene Moran was assigned to the 96th Bombardment Group, 339th Bombardment Squadron of the 8th Air Force. His base, RAF Snetterton Heath, England. His aircraft, a B-17F named Ricky Tiki Tavi, after the mongoose in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. His position, tail gunner. Moran and his crew flew 3 missions without incident. The fourth was Bremen. On November 29, 1943, more than 300 B-17s launched toward the German port city. Ricky Tiki Tavi was in formation. The bomb run was completed. Bombardier Donald Curtis released the payload over the target. Then, on the turn for home, something changed. The aircraft began to lag. It slipped out of formation, into open sky, alone. German fighters noticed immediately. Bf-110 heavy fighters attacked first, firing 21-centimeter Werfer granite rockets designed to disrupt bomber formations at range. Then came the single-engine fighters, Bf-109s and FW-190s, closing aggressively from multiple angles. They swarmed the isolated bomber. Moran fired from the tail. Waist gunners returned fire from the sides. It was not enough. One by one, voices disappeared from the intercom. 8 crewmen were killed. Only 2 remained alive inside the aircraft. Moran in the tail and navigator Jesse Orson in the nose. Orson bailed out through the forward hatch. Moran could not. The crawl tunnel forward was blocked by damage. His tail escape hatch had twisted shut under structural stress. His parachute had been shredded by gunfire. Then flak struck. A burst tore through the fuselage and split the aircraft apart. The cockpit, wings, and engines sheared away and fell. The tail section, roughly 12 feet of aluminum, separated cleanly and began to drop. Moran was still inside it. There were no functional control surfaces, no engine thrust, no wings that mattered, just wreckage. Pinned between ammunition boxes and the twin Browning .50 caliber machine guns, Moran fell from 28,000 feet. What happened next was witnessed from the ground and later confirmed after the war. As the tail section spun through open sky, German Bf-109 pilots continued to attack it. Some likely believed it was still a controllable aircraft. Others may have thought it was attempting a glide. It appeared to move with some degree of stability. Inside that falling wreckage, Moran fired back. He aimed both Brownings at fighters making passes and pulled the triggers. He was shooting at enemy aircraft while falling 4 miles, without a parachute. German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground also opened fire, adding flak bursts around the descending debris. The sky around him was still a battlefield. The tail section eventually struck trees near a wooded area outside a small village south of Bremen. The impact was violent. Moran's head slammed into his machine guns. His skull fractured. Both forearms were broken. Several ribs shattered. He was bleeding heavily, but he was alive. 2 Serbian prisoners of war, both doctors, witnessed the crash and ran to the wreckage. They pulled Moran free and provided immediate treatment. Later, in a German prisoner of war camp, a Serbian surgeon placed a metal plate over the damaged portion of Moran's skull. He spent the next 17 months in captivity. He was transferred between camps across Germany and Poland. As the Third Reich collapsed in early 1945, Moran was forced on a 600-mile march westward with other prisoners. On April 26, 1945, American forces reached Bitterfeld, Germany, and liberated the camp. Moran weighed 128 pounds. He had survived falling from 28,000 feet inside a severed tail section and survived the war. But he was not the only tail gunner to fall from the sky and live. 3 months before Moran's fall, and 3 months after it, another airman rode a detached tail section to the ground. He did not have a damaged parachute. He had no parachute at all. On January 11, 1944, 21 B-17 SS of the 15th Air Force lifted off from Italy, heading toward the harbor at Piraeus, Greece, and one of them would not return intact. Sergeant James Allen Rayleigh was in the tail of a B-17 called Skippy, leading the 2nd Squadron of the 301st Bomb Group. He had been in the Army since 1935. In 1943, he transferred to the Army Air Forces. He loved the tail gunner position. It suited him. On January 11, 1944, the formation climbed through heavy cloud cover. Visibility dropped to near zero. Pilots could barely see past their own wingtips. Standard procedure required trailing squadrons to alter course briefly to create spacing. It wasn't enough. 2 B-17s from the 97th Bomb Group flew almost head-on into the 301st Formation. The collision triggered a chain reaction inside the clouds. Metal tore, aircraft disintegrated. Men and debris fell through the overcast. 8 B-17s were destroyed within minutes. 64 airmen were killed, 17 survived. There were no enemy fighters, no flak, just weather and the unforgiving geometry of blind formation flight. Rayleigh felt what he later described as a hell of a jolt. At 19,000 feet, the 12-foot tail section of Skippy was sheared clean from the rest of the aircraft. The cockpit, wings, engines, everything forward, went one direction. Rayleigh went another. He was wedged between his twin .50 caliber machine guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. There was no room to move. His parachute was nearby, but he could not create enough space to put it on. The escape hatch closest to him was twisted shut. There was nothing he could do. The tail section began to spiral. Blue sky, cloud, earth, cloud again, over and over as the wreckage rotated. Rayleigh could not see the rest of the aircraft. He believed the entire bomber might still be attached, corkscrewing downward. He later estimated the fall lasted 10 to 15 minutes. At 19,000 feet, with the drag created by a spinning tail section, that estimate was plausible. He prayed. He thought about his family, 8 siblings back on a Kentucky farm. He told himself that in a few minutes he would be dead. The tail struck trees on a mountainside. Branches absorbed part of the impact. The wreckage stopped. Rayleigh was alive. His chest hurt, but he could move his arms. His legs worked. He freed himself from the ammunition piled around him and forced open the damaged bulkhead. The escape hatch was still jammed. He crawled out through the opening in the twisted metal. He stood alone on a mountainside. There was no airplane, only a fragment of tail section wedged into trees. He climbed down the slope, moving from tree to tree until he reached a trail. Rain began to fall. Hours later, he heard voices. Greek civilians found him and took him to an Orthodox monastery where priests were sheltering Allied servicemen. Of the 17 men who survived the mid-air disaster that day, Rayleigh was the only one who did so without a parachute. After recovering, he returned to duty. He went back to the tail. He flew more missions. After the war, he continued serving in Korea, then Vietnam, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He later visited the families of every crew member who died aboard Skippy. He eventually married Lorraine Lineberry, the widow of Skippy's co-pilot. He wrote his autobiography under a title that said everything, "I fell 4 miles and lived." He died in 1999 at 82 years old and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Eugene Moran returned to Wisconsin. He married. He raised 9 children. He went back to the farm life he had left behind. In 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove named a street in his honor. He died on March 23, 2014 at age 90. Larry Stevens went home to California and rarely spoke about the war. His neighbors knew him as a fire captain. Only decades later, when his granddaughter helped him write his memoir, did most people around him understand what he had survived. 3 tail gunners, 3 different paths through the same war. One completed 35 missions and walked away. One fell 4 miles inside a shattered aircraft and kept firing on the way down. One rode a severed tail section through the clouds without a parachute and lived to fight in 2 more wars. None of them chose the tail because it was safe. They did the job because it had to be done. Nearly 20,000 rear gunners did not come home. If this story gave you a clearer understanding of what they faced, consider subscribing to Battalica and supporting the channel. These stories matter, and the more people who hear them, the less likely they are to be forgotten. I want to ask you something. If you had been assigned to a heavy bomber, tail, ball turret, waist, nose, which position would you have taken? Or would you have chosen none at all? Tell me in the comments. And if someone in your family served as a gunner, a grandfather, an uncle, someone from your town, write their name below. Names matter. They still do.